Now, the US had put a $10 million bounty on his head, and yet, despite wandering into the home in which he was hiding and building a forward operating military base just 3 miles from his home, they never found the man they deemed the most wanted terrorist, Mullah Omar, the founding leader of the Taliban. That's all in a new biography on his life, which says he was in a village in Afghanistan. Searching for an Enemy is a new book by author and journalist Bette Dam, who has spent 5 years researching Omar's life. Miss Dam, thanks so much for coming in to speak with us. Tell me more, first of all, about this. We were told he was in Pakistan, that he had fled, but according to your research, Mullah Omar actually spent all the years following the September 11th attacks in Afghanistan in pretty humble surroundings.
Yeah. During the 5 years, I always thought that it must be Pakistan where he was hiding, because, and Kabul government said that, but also the American intelligence were saying that, the Pentagon was saying this. But I found, after some investigation and then trying hard to speak to actually eyewitnesses, that the situation was different, that Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, actually chose to stay very, very close to his tribe, basically with a bodyguard and a driver who also was very much related to this tribe in that little area in Zabul, province of Zabul. And he did not trust Pakistan. He did not want to cross the border.
OK, so that's his choice. But it turned out to be a pretty dangerous one nonetheless, because on a few occasions, the US troops came pretty close to where he was.
Yeah, so the bodyguard I interviewed, who stayed with him until his death, described a couple of times that foreign troops entered the village and also entered his house. I don't know if they were looking for Mullah Omar. From the interviews with the Americans on this basis around him, I got the idea that they were more or less focused on other things, like keeping the roads open. Sometimes they were just saying, we tried to survive. And they were actually also, I felt a little bit like a tunnel vision of like Mullah Omar must be in Pakistan, so we are not going to look inside Afghanistan for this.
And indeed, they were Taliban strongholds where he was hiding out, so I guess they had other things to look out for. But that is quite surprising to think that the US intelligence, with all its resources, got it so wrong.
Is that surprising? Because I think overall, after 2001, there's been several issues with military intelligence from the US and also from countries like Kabul. I think the Iraq War was an example of making up intelligence. But also in 2001, we had something very interesting where basically most of the Taliban tried to surrender to the new government. Hamid Karzai was at that time the president. That was blocked by the US, did not want the Taliban to be part of it. Well, they're now talking to them. And also maybe on Osama bin Laden, for a long time they said he was hiding in the mountains in between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that was not in the villa they found him in Abbottabad. So there's enough reason to, as a journalist, to not trust one of all the parties involved, not the Taliban, not Washington, D.C., and also not Kabul, but just try to be independent and find sources.
And one thing that is interesting also in your book is that information that, following the 2001 attacks, we all believed, or we were told at least, that Mullah Omar was still the head of the Taliban. And this is something you found out to be completely untrue. It looks like he really retired and took a very distinctive step back.
Exactly, but I also found two things. I think in general, we mainstream media, journalists, are a little bit too close to that Western narrative. I think if in an ideal situation we would have as many telephone numbers of opposition figures as DC or Kabul in our phones, then it would be much more balanced. I felt by interviewing Taliban that I was one of the few who did that, which is not good in general. You are dealing with the war with several parties. If you are against them or not against them, that doesn't matter. If you write about the terrorists, you are not with them.
No, and other journalists have done it. And I believe even you felt the fact that you were an unarmed woman actually opened more doors than closed them, which was interesting. But going back to Mullah Omar, it sounds like he was no longer the head of the Taliban, after the 2001 attacks, yet he was portrayed as such even beyond after his death. Also, he was The US led the story that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were quite close. This is something you also have put holes in as well. And that's quite an important question, especially when you look now at the peace talks between the US and the Taliban.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Other subject that is about the relationship. The US connects Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I think that is based on my information, not the right conclusion. I think you need to know from the field why Al-Qaeda is different from the Taliban. You need to know why the Taliban is not very close to them. Not during the Taliban time, not Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden were not the buddies who were preparing 9/11 together. So, yeah, that's a long story, but I think you need to be very critical on that. The US is having its own narrative, and as a journalist, you need to be...
So what do you make of the current talks between the Taliban and US officials?
I think we have seen many attempts to speak to the Taliban. In general, I think it is important to include them. I think it would have been much easier to do that when the Taliban and Karzai were so close, the former president were so close, and the Taliban was basically nothing anymore. Now we are dealing with a very complex situation. And it's more difficult than ever. I think military intervention, throwing bombs, using drones, is much easier than now talking to them, with all their internal differences as well, and an American state who wants to leave. So I think it's good that it was always a political conflict, much more than a military one. So it's good, but it's also very difficult right now.
Indeed, and one wonders of the position of the Taliban today, as opposed to back in 2001, when you said really it had disbanded.
Yeah, it's totally different. It's painful also to see. I think it was not necessary. And one of the conclusions of this biography on Mullah Omar is it was not a necessary war per se after 2001. So it's very painful to see that now so many areas are in the hands of opposition, Taliban or related groups.
And indeed, I haven't seen official reaction from the United States to your book, but Afghanistan has been pretty vocal, putting pressure on you, saying, you know, for them it's absolutely untrue he was in Pakistan. You know, I feel they've been reaching out to you pretty strongly. Yeah,
both responses are interesting. The silence in Washington, D.C. is as interesting as the loud response from Kabul, I would say. Kabul is very much on this narrative that the Taliban is a puppet of Pakistan that is against them. Now, let me put this straight. I think there's a lot of Taliban who live and are hiding in Pakistan. I'm not saying that that is not true, that Pakistan is not a proxy country in this situation, but not for Mullah Omar, and there's other big Taliban leaders who live in Afghanistan and not in Pakistan. But also Mullah Omar was not there, and it's a difficult thing, and I understand that. I mean, there's been a war, there's many people have died, and now the most wanted, the information about the most wanted, the government spread around, is opposed, and that triggers an emotional response.
Indeed, and absolutely an emotional response, and we'll have to see and perhaps make us all question a bit more all the stories that we're being told. Well, I look forward. Your book is out in Dutch and will be forthcoming, I imagine, in English. I look forward to that. Ms. Bette Dam, thanks so much for coming into studio and telling us a bit more.